Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're back for another edition of What's Going On FlinkTalkRadio.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and we are delighted, as always, to have you out there in the listenership and viewership of the program that comes on from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock every Monday. And every second and fourth Monday, the program is preceded by Satura's Black History Corner, which is hosted by Miss Catherine William, Miss Catherine Blake. And they bring to you a 30-minute program approximately every 2 weeks on the second and fourth Mondays. So we're back again, and we're going to be picking up where we left off last week. I did promise to bring the books back to the studio so we can have a continued conversation about what we were talking about last week. And we were talking about Islam and some of the things we need to be aware of about the problems that are taking place in the Middle East, but not just consigned to the Middle East, but also around other parts of the world. And we have to look out for what's happening inside of our own shores. I'm going to be reading some of the excerpts from 3 different books before we leave this afternoon. But I want to start off by talking about what we have in the mix in the future. I'm working on a project that I'm going to be finishing up. Hopefully next week I'll be ready to do something on the air, and also I'll be doing it on Facebook. What I have in mind to do is a 5-part series that I've been working on, taking notes on, and reading various books to do a piece on the monetary system of the United States. Because I don't think we understand how the monetary system works in this country. And I wanted to use a couple of sources to build up my own inventory of understanding of what this is all about and how the monetary system does operate. And I've been reading quite extensively books by Murray Rothbard, for example. That book is a major piece. It's not a very big book, but it's a major read in terms of information that he actually shares. And his book is called A Case Against the Fed. And the book I just finished, which is quite another kind of, I think that they have a lot in common, Rothbard's book and then the book by Ron Chernow's book called The House of Morgan. I think they have a lot in common, although they're not writing from any particular central place of understanding. They understand it from where they are, but the conclusions are very similar, and I'll be using those 2 books pretty much as the takeoff point when I do my series. But that's coming down the pipe, and I think I'll have that ready in about 2 weeks. If not, we won't come out there with the writing on it, and we won't do anything on FlinkTalkRadio.com until we are extremely assured that we are ready to come out and do something in the public. We don't like to come out with our I's not dotted and our T's not crossed and do things in happenstance. We want to make sure we are able to do it in more than a piecemeal fashion. Today, I'm going to continue this discussion on what I think is a major problem that we are facing. Not the major problem, but one of the major problems that the U.S. is facing and the world is facing, and that is this scourge that we see taking place around the world, centered in the Middle East. And I want to bring to your attention some of the comments made by those who are writing about it. And I'm talking about 3 different books. And there are other books out there as well. But the 3 books I'm talking about will be the books written by Robert Spencer, another major work by Bat Year, and the book by Bruce Bauer. We'll start out with Robert Spencer's book. It's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades. And all I'm going to be doing in all 3 of the books is just reading the peripheral parts of the book, basically what those that are in the know about what is really going on that are not politically correct. There are comments about what these writers have come up with and what they're writing about in these 3 books. The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades has as its introduction these kinds of comments. And I'll stop after each bullet and we'll spend a little bit of time just talking about that. He says, you think you know about Islam. And he says, but did you know, and he lists a couple of things that are not as well known, and the first one being, did you know that Islam teaches that Muslims must wage war to impose Islamic law on non-Muslim states? How many persons know that? Did you know that American Muslim groups are engaged in a huge cover-up of Islamic doctrine and history? I don't think anybody in Washington knows that one. Did you know that today's jihad terrorists have the same motives and goals as the Muslims who fought during the Crusades? I mean, we got people talking about ISIS and acting as if this is something new because he changed their name. I mean, we had heard of, the names can change, right? But the philosophy, where's the philosophy come from? How new is that? So we now got ISIS, and they say, well, ISIS is a spinoff of Al-Qaeda. Okay, how do they differ? And so the third bullet he has here, today's jihad terrorists have the same motives and goals as the Muslims who fought and waged war in the Crusades. So, since the names have been changed, does that mean that the philosophy has been changed? That's what he's raising here in this book by Robert Spencer. The Crusades, another point, the Crusades were defensive conflicts. In other words, what you have in Europe, for example, is Europe fighting a defensive conflict. And we're going to talk about why that was being waged at that time, almost reflectively so and instinctively so, and why it's not being resisted right now. Something is wrong with Europe. And we've got to talk about what that is in terms of why Europe is no longer standing as it did in the past to wage off what is going on right now. In fact, Europe is in almost complete denial of that, of what it needs to do is in terms of waging some defensive posturing against what is happening in Europe right now. There's a reason why that's not going on. And I think as we get into this discussion, you'll see what I'm talking about, because in the writing of those who are praising this book, I want to read what they said, some of them have said about it, and you'll get a picture, hopefully, about why there is this, not this resistance, we don't see the resistance against what's taking place, but an actual denial of what's going on the land space of Europe. let me read some person that commented on the book. One of them is the comment on the book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. One of the persons that commented on it is the author by the name of Bat Year, B-A-T, first name, Year, Y-E, apostrophe, O-R, Y-E-O-R, Y-E, apostrophe O-R. And he's the author of the book Eurabia, the Euro-Arab Axis, the Euro-Arab Axis. And he writes some comments about Robert Spencer's book. And the first one that is quoted in writing the praise for this book by Robert Spencer is the author of the book Eurabia. So I want to read his comments, because I think that that's a good intro into the other comments being made by those who are writing and praise what Spencer came up with in his book. Bat Year says, with a provocative and irreverent style, Robert Spencer assails with much erudition the taboos imposed by the politically correct league, a daring tonic that teaches fundamental truths. So that's his praise for what Spencer has done in this book. But I think even more to the point is what even Warrock wrote. And Warrock is the author of the book, Why I Am Not a Muslim, and the editor of Leaving Islam and What the Quran Really Says. You know, what we don't read, at least yet, the Arabic language. And so we have the translation out of it. But I've listened to Bridget Gabriel, whom I have a lot of respect for, who wrote the book called They Must Be Stopped. And her first book was called Because They Hate. And I listened to her, and she said that some of what is translated out of the Arabic into other languages is mistranslated deliberately because the attempt is to kind of give another image of what is really called for. But if that's true, then what is in fact transcribed is still problematical, because there's enough there still that causes what we are seeing. I see it being acted out in these organizations that we are having these beheadings taking place. And what has been translated is consistent with what we are seeing taking place. The last week, the report was that 7 men and 3 women were beheaded. And they don't care anything about political correctness. So let's see what Ibn Warraq, W-A-R-R-A-Q, author of Why I Am Not a Muslim. Let's see what he has to say about Robert Spencer's book. He says, the jihad that the Western world faces today is identical in its motivations and goals to that which Europe managed to stave off almost 1,000 years ago, thanks in large part to the Crusades, of which the West is now ashamed. In this book, Robert Spencer tells the truth that few in the U.S. or Europe wish to face. Today's jihad, as Spencer illustrates, is proceeding on 2 fronts. Now, this is really important. Islam, he says, is jihad, but I don't really make a distinction, really. Here's my view, and I'll state it up front. I don't really make a distinction, as many people do, between Islam and jihad, because I don't consider jihad to be anything other than an expression of Islam, a militant expression of Islam. And this idea that there are moderate expressions of it, I agree with those practitioners of Islam that say there is only one Islam. I agree with that, at least as it relates to that which is practiced in the Middle East. Now, I've seen Islam in another dispensation because I have seen it being practiced in West Africa. And there is a different expression of it there. But I'm talking about the Islam that is on the move and the Islam that was on the move in the past that comes out of the Middle Eastern expression of Islam. And that Islam is very consistent, and I don't think you can divide it up into moderate and non-moderate Islam. I think there's only one Islam here. Now, there's one Islam in West Africa as well, but that's not the Islam that we're talking about, and that's not the Islam that Robert Spencer is writing about here when he talks about the politically incorrect guide to Islam and the Crusades, because that was not the Islam in places like Gambia and Senegal and some of those other West African states. There's a different expression there. I'm talking, and even in Indonesia with 207 million Muslims there. There are 250 million people in Indonesia altogether. 90 some odd percent of the population is Muslim, but about 40 million are not. And you don't see the militant expressions of Islam coming out of Indonesia either. So I want to particularize it to a certain expression of Islam. And there's only one expression that you have there. You're not going to find a distinction between moderate and militant, as they're trying to make a distinction in the Western world, trying to get away from the frightening aspect of what they're dealing with by denying that they're looking at what they're looking at. And they're looking at it consistently throughout the Middle East and looking at it throughout the Western world, where it is now housed. So I want to pay attention to what Warwick is saying here, because Warwick is making a distinction here about two different expressions of Islam, or as he says, jihad. But I don't make a distinction between the expression of Islam and the expression of jihad, as it is in fact portended from its expression in the Middle East, and those who are bringing out the Middle East and other parts of the world. He says that Robert Spencer tells the truth that few in the U.S. or Europe wish to face. In other words, in the Middle East, in Europe and in the United States, there is a certain ostrich type of response to Islam, burying your head in the sand and expecting the problem to disappear if you don't discuss it. Or if you deny it is taking place within the psychological parameters in which it's being expressed, which we all see. There's one thing you can say is that there's no political correctness in terms of what ISIS is doing. They're not trying to be popular, and they're not yielding to international outcry against what it is that they're doing. If they did, they would start with James Foley, or with the other person they've caught, journalists, not even military people, and they would have stopped there. But we just read where 10 persons were beheaded this past week, seven of them men and 3 of them women. So we're dealing with something that is consistent in the Middle East. Now, what Warwick is saying is that today's jihad, or I should say today's expression of Islam coming out of the Middle East, is proceeding on 2 fronts. And we need to pay attention to what those 2 fronts are, because they are very critical to understand. He says one of those fronts is violence and terror. We saw it in the United States when Islam announced its presence, or jihad announced its presence on 9/11 in the United States. That's the violence and terror aspect of it. We saw it again at Fort Hood with Nidal Hassan. Or we saw it with the 2 immigrants from Chechen at the Boston Marathon. We've seen it in terms of trying to thwart others who tried to bring terrorism to the soil and were thwarted because there was intervention with the FBI having intervened and stopping some of it. But it would have been much more widespread if it had not been stopped, because my understanding is that 50 some odd other expressions have been thwarted because there was an intelligence gathering that allowed the intervention to take place and stop those things from taking place. But we're seeing violence and terror taking place as one expression of it. We can all see that. Here's what we don't see. Because Warwick is talking about another expression of it that is much more subtle, written about by Robert Spencer in another one of his books called Stealth Jihad. Stealth Jihad meaning that that's the more subtle type of jihad that's being practiced. And he says that another expression of jihad comes about through cultural shaming and the rewriting of history. Rewriting of history. So that the victims become the terrorists. Here is, coming on Spencer's book, here is a devastating repost of that revisionism and a clarion call for the defense of the West before it is too late. And in Europe, it may well be too late. And I'll get to that when we get to the book by Bruce Bauer and Badier's book. And just read some excerpts from those who've written about those two. It goes on, and there's another person, the author of The Sword of the Prophet, written by Serge Trikovic, Trifkovic. And what he says in praise of Spencer's book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam, is that the value of Spencer's book is twofold. He reminds us of the consequences of our failure to come to grips with the message and implications of Islam. And he warns against the spirit of masochistic self-loathing that permeates the Western elite class. That's our politicians, primarily, who are deceiving themselves and in the process deceiving us into believing that the threat is not what the threat is, and also the threat is only elsewhere. That's part of it as well. Part of their denial is that Islam is the threat of the Islamic threat is elsewhere, and part of it is that it is in fact peaceful in its intentionalities. Even the stealth aspect is a form of warfare, because some warfare is psychological. In fact, I'm looking at what they're doing right now in this bombing that's going on over here in Iraq and in Syria, where they're bombing. This is not even a serious engagement. Bombing some buildings that nobody is in. Some of them have not been used because they have no further utility, and they're over there bombing that. And they've already announced to the ISIS and whatever group you want to call, whatever name you want to call them by, ISIL, ISIS, and IS. I guess if you lower the number of letters in the name calling, it means that the threat is being lowered. But they're bombing these buildings and telling them that we don't plan to put boots in the ground, and we don't plan to be, what they're really saying is we don't plan to be serious about confronting this group. But they're over there bombing buildings, and what does that do? It does nothing, because you cannot defeat an enemy, in the wars that we've had throughout the history of the world prove it. You don't win wars by bombing buildings and destroying tanks. The enemy is not defeated until you destroy his will to fight. You can go back and see that in terms of what happened when we faced a country that had another expression of God, a godlike presence in the fighting apparatus. And that was in Japan, where they had this idea that Haruhito was a godlike figure. And we dropped an atom bomb on Hiroshima August the 6th, 1945. And then 3 days later, because they had not surrendered, and that was an atom bomb dropped on a major industrial city. And 3 days later, they had not given up. And they dropped another bomb on Japan. These are nuclear weapons. And did that August the 9th, 1945. And they still didn't give up. And it took them 6 additional days to finally decide to surrender. So that was 9 days beyond a nuclear weapon being dropped on Japan, and they still did not surrender. Why? Because they had the idea that Haruhito was a god. And that explains the kamikaze, airplanes diving into ships. That explains what happened at Okinawa, where you don't see any Japanese surrendering. They had 100,000. There were fewer people killed with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which might have so been out of shape about it, feeling ashamed of. There were fewer people killed in those 2 bombings than it was at Okinawa, where you don't see any Japanese throwing their hands up in the air because you had to kill them all in order to win that island. There were about 1,200 left out of 100,000 that were there on that island because they would not surrender. And that's the formidable opposition that the West is facing right now. He's talking about 2 expressions of it. One is the military aspect of jihad, but that's probably not the most threatening part of it. It's threatening enough, but it may not be the most critical aspect of it, because when people are bombing, you kind of know to defend yourself, but there's another expression of it that's even more it's insidious, and so, therefore, in some ways, more dangerous. And he says that there are 2 fronts that jihad is being fought on. One of them is violence and terror. We all see that one. The one that's hidden, and the one that Robert Spencer writes about in another one of his books, and I read, I think, every book he's put out there on this. But he says the other expression of it is cultural shaming. In other words, the other expression of it is when you begin to talk, as we're talking here in this program, about what is happening, then the claim is that you are being Islamic phobic.
If you don't agree and go become a Muslim, then you're the enemy.
Yeah,
you're opposing Islam. There's no way of saying about it. There's no middle ground. There's no, like, you live your life, I live mine. They got to make you live their lifestyle. If you don't, then you're going to have to either die or become a slave.
That's a requirement. And we have seen this throughout Islam's history since 630. I'm not talking about this. I'm not talking about the time of a watch. I'm talking about the year, because if you go back and you study the Islamic incursions, or the military aspect of Islam, you see it starting in 630. Now in 622, what you see, which is 1 AH, because that's the flight, 622 would be 1 El Hijra, which means that's when the Prophet decided that they could not defend Islam in Mecca because there was too much opposition. So what is celebrated in Islam is that the Prophet fled from Mecca and went to Medina, and that's what everybody talks about, him going to Medina. But they didn't not all the ones who were in this incubation stage of Islam went to Medina. Some of them went to Africa. and they were welcomed into Africa particularly in Ethiopia. And so they went there also. But in 630, when there was enough military apparatus in place right now, and the numbers of practitioners of Islam had grown, now the prophet is ready to go back into Mecca. And when he comes back into Mecca, he's not carrying a flower, he's carrying a sword. And so 630 AD, or you want to say 630 CE, that's fine also, meaning the Common Era. If you don't want to use religious terms, you want to use clinical terms or non-sectarian terms, you could say CE, the Common Era, but we would say 630 AD if you're a Christian, which means 630 Anno Domini, 630 years after Jesus Christ. And in 630, the prophet comes out of Medina into Mecca, and now he's coming back to reclaim the place that he fled from 8 years earlier. And he does not bring tulips, he brings a sword on the land space. And they fight for Islam's existence on that land space. 2 years later, the prophet dies in 632. But the militant expression of Islam does not die with the prophet. It goes into Egypt, for example, in 639, and eventually it will be all over the northern part of Africa. Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania. Those 6 nations in northern Africa. And none of that was through tea leaves. This is a military presence of Islam. And I consider 630 to be the first jihadist expression of Islam, starting in Mecca and then feeding out into areas around Saudi Arabia. It says Mecca's in Saudi Arabia. And it goes south and it goes west. That would be the first in the 630s, and in which would be the 7th century, you see the first expression of it. Then, I think the second tidal wave would be, that tidal wave wasn't really completed because you would see it going into Europe in the 8th century, crossing over into Iberia in 711 under General Tariq. Gibraltar, the Rock of Gibraltar is named after this general. And in 711, and some of us are actually behind our own backs paying attention to that date. Just like in Spain right now, when they have the racing of the bull, they don't recognize they're behind their own back. They're actually celebrating 711 also. Because when they say ole in fighting the bull, that's also an expression of that. Because ole is Allah. You see, there are certain residual aspects of this military presence. And in 711, which is the stores we have called 711 stores around various neighborhoods, you're celebrating that date. But 711 is a date in which Islam crosses over into Europe, into Western Europe. And it is fighting its way on the soil, taking over both Spain and Portugal, the 2 nations in the Iberian Peninsula. You know, the peninsula is a place that has its land space surrounded by 3 sides of water. If it's all surrounded by water, then that's an island. But this is the peninsula. And it is surrounded on three sides by water, the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean, and then, of course, the place where there is no water, which makes it a peninsula, would be that there are the Pyrenees Mountains that separate Spain and Portugal from, well, Spain pretty much, from the next country above it, which is France. And when Islam got a control over Spain and Portugal, particularly Spain, it would now want to advance and try to advance into the northern part of Europe. And it took Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. Martel means the hammer. And his name was Charles, and the name Martel came after the battle that was fought in 732 called the Battle of Tours, and the name the hammer was because he hammered and nailed the boards down and stopped the incursion. I think that is the first dispensation of this military apparatus we're talking about. And it loses steam after that was over, but it did not in fact forget what its mission was. And you'll see it pick up again through the Crusades, and you see it in 1098 where there's another rest period. And during the Crusades, the Christians are focused upon having to resist it because at that time Europe was under the banner of the Catholic Church up until 1517, and they were resisting this because they had their own views, religious views, and therefore they were in opposition to that. But see, I was saying earlier that that's one Europe, but the Europe we have right now is different. Because you see, today, what Europe's problem is that Europe is now secular. And so you don't have the kind of religious claim among the European, generally in the European population. So the level of resistance to the presence of Islam on the soil is different. And that explains why it is different.
I don't understand. The left in this country, the liberals in this country, they have a tendency to demonize anybody who questions this growing presence of Islam in the United States. Yet they also try to keep afloat, keep this juggling act going on about human rights and the acceptance of gay rights and the expansion of them, and also gay and lesbian relationships being equal status. How do you reconcile this with the fact that these people, if they actually truly embrace Islamic ideology and their morality in that, is not going to be tolerant? Tolerance is not something in there. Mm-hmm. I just don't understand how these people think they can keep all these elements. They're going to be able to synergize all these. I just don't see that.
Well, we're talking about intolerance. Let me read something from the other book that I brought, one of the other two books that I brought, While Europe Slept. How Radical Islam is Destroying the West from Within. Don't forget what I said earlier about Robert Spencer's book and what was said about the two aspects of this jihadist expression, one of which is the military and violent and terrorist wing of it in terms of what we're seeing in the beheading of persons trying to destroy the morale of the West. And the other expression of it is the more subtle approach to it, and that is the culture shaming of the West. And that guilt that we see, the West feels. The West is the only place in the world, as a matter of fact, we have a lot of it here too, in the United States, but in Western Europe, the West is the only part of the world that is guilty about doing what really is not remarkable. I mean, the world has been a nest age, a nest egg of civility. The West the world has been a violent place, but the only place that you see apology for it is in the Western world. I mean, it's amazing that I look on page 111 of Thomas Sowell's book. I quote that quite a bit. the book called Black Rednecks. I know y'all think all the rednecks are in Appalachia. He has a book out, and it's called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And on page 111 of that book, that's the first page of chapter 4, and Thomas Sowell demonstrates this idea that slavery, for example, is just something happened in the West. It didn't happen anywhere else, just over here, because the only ones that feel guilty about it are those in the West. But it's a universal practice. The West is the one that brought an end to it. I mean, not brought an end to it, but brought an end to it in Western societies.
Yeah, ironically, it's because of capitalism and they seeing the individual as a value because they were a potential customer base. Ironically, probably helped give rise to the idea of human rights across the spectrum. That's really because you wanted to maximize your profit. Mm-hmm. And it's ironic that, basically by becoming a potential numbers giver, money giver, you become somebody worthwhile for somebody else to notice that having value. It's bizarre, but that's how it happened.
That's how it happened.
And that wasn't anywhere else but the West.
If you say that, John, on a college campus today, you would have all kinds of invectives against your humanity, because they're not buying that this is a matter of because capitalism is being characterized as inhuman, exploitative, and the idea that capitalism puts an end, put an end to slavery and brought about a new kind of human relationship in the world. I mean, that would fly nowhere in any places that I've seen.
Another thing is, too, they say that, capitalism gave birth to slavery. I think slavery is just a continuation of feudalism. And matter of fact, and I think it's there's more of a parallel. Mm-hmm. And you get all these Marxists. I mean, these people hate the horrors of the slave shops, and stuff like that. Not slave shops, but the sweatshops. Oh, and they were horrible. And the UAW was created for a real reason. They were brutal to the workers. You could get your hand cut off. They just wanted, the first thing they made sure is you're timed out. You were clocked out before they actually tried to, if they did address that issue. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I can understand humanity. But communism, I mean, let's face it, humans are logs in their fire. They don't give a damn about your individual ideas. They're collectivist. Yeah. They want, and the thing that's always supporting that minutia of the population that runs the place. That's the only ones that actually matters in that world.
Mm-hmm. I want to challenge one thing that you said, John, and that is these sweatshops where children are working and they are in these sweat factories and all of that. The question that is never raised about that is what was the alternative? You see, what you have in those primitive societies right now, we can see how it played out in America during a different time period. I think what we tend to do a little bit of is that we tend to look at modern facilitation and we import that back to more primitive circumstances and we make an indictment based upon how they would play out right now. Here's what I'm saying, John. The alternative, if you don't have the children in the sweatshops and doing the labor that they were doing at that time under, admittedly, inhumane conditions. But the alternative is that given the level of production, if the children are not working also to accommodate the earnings of the parents, then the other alternative is starvation going on in those families. So the children are working because of the lack of productivity of the working because of the absence of technology.
That's a valid point.
Okay, you see what capitalism is doing is also innovating. You see, we're talking about the humanity of capitalism, right? But out of capitalism is also a chance to create a leisure group that is able now to put its attention and its best minds on something else. And what that something else is creating an innovative class now that we never had before.
That's true. See,
Yeah.
I believe that point too. And another thing is too, they always go on about the sweatshops and the labor of the child and how horrific it was, but they don't go about when they're living on the farms. They're working 14 hours a day, 12 to 14 hours a day in the fields, and at very exacting extracting of of their sweat, blood, and everything else. And if they think, and still agriculture still got a high amount of injury happening to the people who work in that field. Mm-hmm. So I mean. You look at his face. Being a farmer was not a very, peaceful existence either. So I mean, a lot of catastrophic things happen on farms, even back then. And it's James Burke makes a point in The Day the Universe Changed. They're looking at insurance tables and stuff like that, actuary tables and all this. But they also started looking at how, diseases are spread and stuff like that. Well, they started making people a statistic. Well, by becoming a statistic, ironically, your life was prolonged. All of our lives are prolonged when somebody started looking at us analytically and seeing why is this population dying? Oh, they got these elements that are in common. They're exposed to maybe a bad water source and stuff. We eliminate this, well, we have a decrease in the deaths amongst this group. By becoming a statistic, the future generations of us actually enjoyed some great benefit off of that. So that's the way it is with capitalism. But these people, I don't know what they want us to go back to. Do they want us all sitting squatting around a fire, rubbing our hands, got oog and og, and we're living in little teepees and wigwams because they have a lesser environmental impact on less impact on the environment? Those jerks are always advocating for that. Are going to have a mansion. They're going to be having, energy consumption. It's 10 times higher than the average of us, So just like Al Gore, that's what I'm aiming at. So
yeah, John, you made some brilliant points in terms of those statements because. And it reminds me of what Ayn Rand writes about in the book called The New Intellectuals, and also in what I consider to be a classic book, and that is The Unknown Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal. Because you almost quoted Rand in terms of she's talking about the bad reputation that capitalism has acquired by those that want to act as if something else has been produced in the world better. It is capitalism that has given the world any level of humanity above what it was practicing before that. Because what it did is that it began to challenge the presence of what she says in the New Intellectuals, the looters in terms of the Attila and the witch doctor. These are the two looters in the world. Attila, meaning the military apparatus that goes in and take wealth, because there's no production of wealth through production, but the way you accumulated wealth before capitalism is that you took the army and rode into the place where they had a lesser military presence and took their wealth and brought it back. Capitalism ends that. The other looter is the witch doctor. The ones up there, with these, you see it like in some of these movies where they're shaking these beads and everything. They're not all doing that now. The witch doctors are those who are selling air sandwiches. And you bring them your wealth and give it to them. And she critiques that. Now, capitalism puts an end to that. You can create wealth and get wealth by producing something that people need and desire and willing to pay you for. And so people out of their own self-interest, a book she has out called The Virtue, and I never thought I would read a book where they can convince me that there's a virtue in selfishness, but she did.
Yeah, what it is
one of her best books.
If you have self-interest, other people, it's basically a Nietzschean concept. Like whatever the ruling class has, the attributes they have, is now transformed. It's no longer good because it's good for the ruling class, but it's not good for all those underneath them because they take and they transform anything they possess, the ruling class rule, and they transform it into a negative. They call it evil. See, there's no good or bad in the Nietzschean viewpoint of the ruling class. There's good and bad, not good and evil. Good is what allows them to have their power and maintain it. Bad is what allows them to lose their power. But evil has got like almost a metaphysical connotation to it, put on those by people who are the slaves or the underlings or whatever. So basically, yeah, what it is recognition basically that when you have this recognition, when you look at these politicians and seeing what they really are advocating is for their own self-interest. Well, when you should be motivated of your self-interest, and anybody outside of you sees your motivated self-interest, they label that, the transformation label, they call that selfishness. If you have any interest in yourself, that's selfish because you're not providing for them or caring for them.
John, another brilliant point. I see what Rand is talking about. Self-interest should be what motivates a person. But out of it is not the isolationist aspect to it, because it's self-interest in the service of others as self-interest. In other words, you cannot serve your own selfish interest by simply locking yourself away from what is the larger good for the society also. In other words, if a person wants somebody's money because he's self-interested in accumulating wealth, he can only do that legally and morally by producing something that the person wants more than he wants his own wealth that he has, let's say dollars or some other material possession. So he's willing to be involved in a voluntary transaction where both parties, and the only ones that would know if they're satisfied in this voluntary transaction, are the two parties involved in it. I'll know whether or not I'm satisfied to pay for the bread at $2.50 a loaf. He will know, the producer will know whether or not he's satisfied in taking $2.50 for the bread that he produced. And only the two of us involved in this transaction would know if we are both satisfied by it. But the person made the bread and make it because he likes George Moss, or even know George Moss's name, or could care less about George Moss's name. He made the bread in his own interest. But in that interest, though, he had to do something, because he can't use force, to make me want to do business with him. And that is, by me having the ability to buy bread, I can then take the time that I would spend by making bread and spend my time doing something else. That's capitalism. And that's a benefit come out of mutual self-interest, selfishness on both our parts, which serves the ends of the progress of society and so on and so forth. And there's been no system, none, zero, nada, that's been produced anywhere in the world that does anything better than that, no matter what you're saying about it. Capitalism is the unknown ideal. Let me go back to this right here, though, in terms of this idea that John raised earlier about the idea of selfishness and how Islam, this idea that Islam is we've got culture shame in the West. Here's what in the book by Bauer, While Europe Slept. As an American living in Europe since 1998, Bruce Baer, B-A-W-E-R, has seen this problem up close, the problem of Islam and what it's doing inside of the West, shaming the West, as if the West should be guilty of something that everybody in the world has practiced. The only one that's carrying any guilt about it is the West, and they're the one putting an end to it. Somebody explain that to me. Across the continent, in Amsterdam, Oslo, Copenhagen, Paris, Berlin, Madrid, and Stockholm, he, meaning the author, encountered large, rapidly expanding Muslim enclaves in which women were oppressed and abused, homosexuals persecuted and killed, quote unquote infidels threatened and vilified, Jews demonized and attacked, barbaric traditions such as honor killing and forced marriages widely practiced, and freedom of speech and religion firmly repudiated. Ain't nobody feeling guilty of any of that. In fact, celebrated. The attack is upon freedom of speech in countries that have had a history of of freedom of speech. And it's going on here too, is that we don't have a First Amendment.
We don't anymore. I mean, if we have anything critical, as a matter of fact, this broadcast can be considered anti-Islamic or Islamic phobic because we're calling questions about their own activities.
Yeah,
that's going to be considered Islamophobic by some. And
yeah.
they think it's hateful to question these new rivals who are coming here in droves, and they are being radicalized, but what our actions are in the Middle East.
That's one criticism that I'm going to have to live with, because I'm willing to, because I am not Islamic phobic, but I'm not even going to discuss whether I'm Islamic phobic or not. Those that want to make that description of what I'm saying here and turn it into that, that's your problem, not mine.
But yeah, they can divide. They did the same thing to Christians, and they want to shoot down the chronology of the Bible, or they wanted to smear the Christian as being an unintelligent boob. That'd be fine. You can mock that. I like to see that kind of those academics engage in that kind of criticism with the Muslims.
Yeah,
I like to see that happen.
Yeah, they're backing the West down. I'm willing to say what I've seen in my travels. I've been in 17 countries in Africa. Out of the 55 countries that are there, 48 of them below the Sahara. And I've been in 17 of those countries, and I will tell you that I've seen Islam in terms of a peaceful expression of Islam. I've not seen it peacefully being engaged in by Islam that is tied into the Middle East. I have not seen it. And this president saying he wants to deal with moderate Islam, he's talking about West Africa then in those places, maybe talking about Indonesia. He's not talking about the Middle East. In fact, the Islam that would be quote-unquote moderate would be that which is in fact by more secular leaders in the Middle East, and those are the ones that the president has overthrown. Mubarak in Egypt, for example. And Gaddafi wasn't bothering anybody, wasn't threatening anybody in the West. And the Obama administration overthrew Gaddafi and put the Muslim Brotherhood in both these places, both in Egypt and in Libya, which it validates any claim that this president wants to deal with moderate Islam, because it was moderated in Egypt by Mubarak. And how did Mubarak get overthrown if this is true that they want to deal with the moderate Islam? Because Mubarak, no matter how much Mubarak was in the tank as far as his dictatorial regime, he did not pose any threat in the least to the West. In fact, I give Mubarak a lot of credit, because when Anwar Sadat, who succeeded him as the leader of Egypt, when Sadat signed a agreement with Menachem Begin in 1978, the singular thing that was accomplished by Carter during his term was at Camp David. They signed an agreement between Egypt, which has 83 million Muslims in it. You're not going to be able to fight against Israel unless you have Egypt on board, because these countries that are in this quote-unquote alliance right now with the United States, they're talking about they're in an alliance with us, we're in an alliance with them, is what it amounts to. But these are very small countries. Saudi Arabia got 28 million, 29 million, somewhere around there. Bahrain about 3 million in, I think Bahrain is, Qatar has 1.3 million. So you can see why they're willing to use us as mercenaries to fight their war for them, which is what we're doing, because they're very small countries. Egypt is not part of that coalition, nor is Iran. Iran got 73 million in that country. But these smaller nations are threatened by ISIS. That's why they've enlisted our military to fight their battle. We're fighting their battle. But I give Mubarak a lot of credit, because Mubarak could have backed down from the agreement that had been signed by Anwar Sadat, because Sadat signed a peace treaty the following year, found an understanding in 78, filed a peace treaty in 79, and took a bullet for it in 81. They killed Anwar Sadat for that while he was at a parade. And people were in the parade, ran out of those cars and ran right to where he was sitting and assassinated Anwar Sadat. It would have been very easy for Mubarak to come in after Anwar Sadat, seeing what happened to him, and tear the accord up. But he didn't do that. He came and kept the accord that was signed in place and maintained that, even though Egypt was kicked out of the Arab League for 10 years, from 1979 to 1989. And he stood up resolutely and maintained that agreement. That guy was overthrown by the Obama administration. So this idea that Obama is for dealing with moderates, you can forget that. The killing of the 4-person Benghazi is the cost of this president's policies. That's not Islamophobic. Those are historical facts. And we got to start talking about what the facts are as far as it's concerned, because while Europe slept, we're seeing what's happening there. And America is sleeping also because the political elites are giving us false information. You're getting it here at flinttalkradio.com, because here, we're going to take the hits and all of that, because we're going to have to tell the truth. And we'll be continuing to do that. And we will bring you what's happening from the standpoint of what the documents show, and not this politically correct nonsense. Okay, we have to get out of here. We get long-winded, and we don't always finish what we came to your studio to do. But we are going to continue this discussion in future programs. Until next time, we want you to follow your dream. Because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.